My name is Devin Lau. I am the Associate Director for Yale Center Beijing, and I'm very happy to see so many people joining us today. I am especially excited for today's talk. I was a history and East Asian studies major and focused on food history. So I must admit that today's talk is a bit of a personal choice to have Roger Crowley join us today. Roger Crowley is a best-selling author and award-winning British historian, and he is a graduate of Cambridge University and has authored six best-selling books on maritime and global history. I'm sure many of you have read some of his books, including 1453, The Holy War for Constantinople and the Clash of Islam in the West, Empires of the Sea, City of Fortune, How Venice Ruled the Seas, and a few others. They've all been translated into many languages. He is a riveting storyteller. I first encountered Roger Crowley through reading his books, and I'm very glad to be welcoming him today to hear him speak about his latest book, Spice, the 16th Century Contest That Shaped the Modern World. I think it's especially appropriate that today's event spans the globe, with myself being here in New Haven at Yale, our speaker, of course, being based in the UK, and many of our audience members based in China and the rest of Asia. And so we'll spend about 40 or so minutes, 40 to 45 minutes, hearing Roger speak, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. And so feel free to enter your questions in the chat box, or at the end, you can raise your hand and I will be moderating that discussion. And so especially excited for today, and I want to also welcome the members that are joining us as part of the Royal Asiatic Society here in Beijing, as well as some people who are joining us as part of our special book program at Yale Center Beijing for the For Humanities program. And so with that, I will stop talking because I want to hear our speakers speak. And so, Roger, I'll turn things over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming along to listen to me. I'm the author of a book, Yale book, called Spice, the 16th Century Contest That Shaped the Modern World. I'm really going to talk about the history and influence of spices on the creation of global economy and global trade in the 16th century. I see the 16th century from a European point of view as an age of acceleration in which things change very quickly. And the reason for that, I think, is to do with exploration. But let's just go back a bit and go back to the idea of spices as a global commodity. We're all familiar with the Silk Road, but alongside that, there has been since ancient times a maritime spice road, very, very ancient. We can look back and we can find 4,000-year-old clove buds on the banks of the Euphrates. We know that in the Han dynasty, within the imperial court, anyone who wished to approach the emperor had to sweeten their breath with cloves. We know that the Romans used spices on their funeral pyres to waft the bodies of the dead up to the world beyond. It's difficult for us now to comprehend how important spices were to people. What did they mean? They thought they were antiseptics. They might have been analgesics, things that would limit pain, aphrodisiacs. But basically, I think spices cheered up people's food. And if we look at the screen in front of you, you can see long distance trade routes stretching from China to Venice. And the spices were transmitted through many hands of many merchants, particularly through the Indian Ocean. How did spices get to Europe? They went from Aden up the Red Sea. They were put on camels, taken to the Nile. They would be floated up the Nile to Alexandria. Merchants would come from Venice and buy spices. And the cost of spices by the time they got to Europe was very, very great. If you think of each merchant putting a little bit more onto the cost, the markup of spices from source to London might be 1,000%. They were very, very pricey. They're ideal first global commodity, lightweight. You can put a lot in the hold of a ship, and they're quite durable. So, what did this mean really in terms of spices in Europe? It meant that they were pricey. It meant that if you were wealthy and you wanted to show off, you'd have spiced your banquet with pepper or ginger, and so there was, this is a glamorous product. Of all the spices that came into Europe, most came from India, pepper and such, ginger and things like that. The rarest and the most expensive of all the spices are those that came from the Malay archipelago. In a little corner of what is now the Philippines, there are a small clutch of islands which produce the rarest and the most valuable spices in the world at that time. Those spices were cloves and nutmeg. And as a result of a freak of evolutionary biology, there are, in a group of islands called the Moluccas, 5 tiny islands, about the size, these islands are only a few kilometers long. These are the only places in the world where cloves grew. 200 miles further south in what is called the Banda Sea, there are 3 islands called the Bandas where nutmeg grew. Very volcanic islands. If you look at the picture down of the Bandas down on the right, you can see it's been hit by a lava flow. This is a very geologically active part of the world. And it was here, actually, the English biologists in the 19th century worked out a theory of evolution. How do these species evolve in these particular places? So nutmeg and cloves were the most expensive, the most and the rarest of all the spices that you could get. We start to see Europe at the end of the 15th century looking at the possibility of how can we reach the Spice Islands without having to pay this enormous cost, would be one way of looking at it. The influence of Marco Polo sits very much behind this. Marco Polo thought that cloves came from China. He must have seen some cloves which had been imported there. But the influence of Marco Polo on the idea of an exotic Orient where spices grew was very significant in the mindset of Europeans. So we start to see at the end of the 15th century attempts by European countries to outflank the Islamic world, because all the spices that they were getting through Egypt were coming through Islamic merchants. And this was kind of a source of great irritation to Europeans, but also an attempt to get rich by outflanking and the huge price hike. There's going to be a rivalry here between Spain and Portugal. Why Spain and why Portugal? These are the countries which flank the Atlantic, and the Atlantic is the only way out for Europeans if they want to explore the world. The first of these, of course, is Columbus. Columbus sets sail from Spain in 1492, and he goes to, he crosses the Atlantic and he comes to some islands, which, as far as we now know, were Cuba and Jamaica and the Bahamas. He thinks that he's close to China. Nobody understood clearly the size of the world because nobody knew about the Pacific Ocean. Following on from that, we see a counter attempt by the Portuguese to sail the other way. The Portuguese worked really hard, really intensely during the 15th century to create a route round Africa, which they do. And in 1498, Vasco da Gama makes it to India. The Portuguese can then set up in India, in Goa, so with a certain amount of valance, and they can start to import pepper and ginger and other spices directly back into Europe. there's a great contest between Spain and Portugal. Uh, During the 15th century, there was a great deal of fighting in the Atlantic between the two countries. And in order to solve or perhaps to demark areas of exploration, in 1494, the Portuguese and the Spanish cut an imaginary line through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which you can see by this arrow, blue arrow here, called the Tordesillas line. And everything east of that line, going east towards the Orient, is going to be Portuguese territory. Anything west of this line is going to be Spanish territory. It's incredibly presumptuous of both Spain and Portugal to think that they could carve up the world in this way. So you can see the Spanish flag on this side of the Tordesillas line and the Portuguese flag on the other side. The problem really with the Tordesillas line is that nobody actually could identify exactly where it was. This is a question of the difficulty from a ship of working out a longitude. Nothing that could be done definitively until maritime clocks in the 18th century. So the position of this Tordesillas line is always kind of a bit obscure. And what is going to happen is they've drawn this line through the Atlantic, but what is going to happen when they get to the other side of the world? And we're going to see this as a contest which is going to be played out in the Spice Islands between these two countries. By 1511, the Portuguese, who are in India, have worked their way down to Malacca on the coast of the Malay archipelago, and they conquer and capture Malacca from an Islamic kingdom. They are now on the outskirts of the Malay archipelago. Arriving in Malacca is very fortuitous for the Portuguese. Here they meet Chinese merchants for the first time, who have a good knowledge of the spice trade, who, by means of which I am uncertain how they communicated, but they learned quite a lot about the spice trade. Malacca is a vassal of China, effectively, and allowed to trade with China. It's interesting also, actually, that the Portuguese account of this meeting in 1511 is the first mention of chopsticks in European languages. It's very odd that Marco Polo, for all the things he did mention, never mentioned chopsticks. From Malacca, the Portuguese are able to hire local pilots to lead them to the Spice Islands. And you can see on my map here that they make their way up to the Moluccas in 1511. The man who leads this expedition is a Portuguese man called Francisco Serrao. And Serrao arrives in the Moluccas, and at that point he goes off message. He settles down in the Moluccas. He has no intention of going back to Portugal or reporting to the Portuguese king, and he starts to lead the life of a Raja in the Moluccas. But what we do know is that somehow ships coming to and fro from Portuguese ships coming to and fro from Malacca to the Moluccas and back again carried letters from Serrao to his friend Fernão Magalhães. Magalhães is a man that we now know as Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan is Portuguese also. Magellan is also ambitious to explore the world. Magellan is out of favor with the Portuguese king. So he leaves Portugal, goes to Spain, and tries to sell the idea of an expedition to the Spice Islands, sailing west to the King Charles I. Magellan is very self-confident, and he does something which is extraordinary. He claims nobody knows whether there is any way through the Americas. Some South America has been explored, but nobody knows if it's a barrier that stretches the length of the planet or whether it is possible to get through the Americas and sail to the Moluccas. He's very self-confident, and he has access to a globe produced in 1515 by a German cartographer called Johannes Schörner. There's his globe on the left. If you look at his globe on the right, you can see a fairly well-shaped South America, because some exploration had taken place down this coast. And you can see that in Schörner's globe, there are two gaps. There's not much sign of North America in this map. There's two gaps, one here, which might just be the Isthmus of Panama, where the landmass is very thin. And the other is, he claims that there is a way around the bottom of South America. No one actually knows. There's a mystery here as to whether this existed or not. But he sells this idea to Charles I, King of Spain. He gets the permission to have an expedition. 5 ships set out from Seville in 1519. They make their way down the coast of South America. It gets very cold. There's a mutiny by some of the men, and he's very ruthless. But they do find a strait round the bottom, what is now the bottom of Argentina, which is now known as the Magellan Strait. It's a brutal voyage. It takes them 36 days to travel 350 miles through this winding, glacial, uninhabited wilderness. That's 10 miles a day. Eventually, they make it into the Pacific Ocean. They only thought that the Pacific Ocean was a narrow sea. Nobody knew that the whole concept of how large the world is was Magellan reckoned the world was smaller than it actually was. It's actually 9,500 miles across. But the sailing is quite easy because the wind blows them steadily across the Pacific Ocean. When they get to this star in the middle, this is the equatorial line. And Magellan knew that the Moluccas were right in the middle of the equatorial line. And it would have been very easy at this point for Magellan's pilots to just sail west and hit the Moluccas. But he doesn't do that. And we're slightly mystified why. And I think the reason is that Magellan knew that the Portuguese were installed in the Moluccas. He would not be popular because he's a traitor. He's gone to Spain. So instead of that, he keeps heading northwest to the Philippines, which are possibly still within Portuguese territory. And at this point, Magellan goes a little bit crazy. They've been at sea for 9,500 miles. And he gets the idea that he can conquer the Philippines quite easily. And he decides to take on the local tribal chief, who's called Lapu-Lapu, in a battle called the Battle of Mactan. 100 Spaniards armed with rifles against 1,500 native people armed with bows and arrows. It doesn't go very well for Magellan. Magellan is killed. To this day, every year in the Philippines, they reenact the murder or the death of Magellan. And this is taken as a founding moment in the history of the Philippines as a nation. There are all sorts of side events in relation to this whole spice race, if you can call it that. By this stage, only 2 of the 5 ships are left. And the ships make it to the Spice Islands. The Portuguese fleet is not there at that moment. They get lucky. They load up their 2 ships with spices, and then they have a choice. How are they going to get home again? One ship, the Trinidad, decides that it will sail back across the Pacific Ocean. The other ship will try and sail round through what is effectively Portuguese territory back to Spain. The ship that sails east is blown back by the Pacific winds and is captured by the Portuguese. The ship that sails west under Juan Sebastian Elcano, who was the second in command. They dodge a Portuguese fleet, which is looking for them, and they make it back to Seville. And this is an extraordinary moment in the European concept of the world, that the world is global, you can sail around it. And the tale of extraordinary suffering, really. 280 men effectively set out from Seville, and 15 make it back again. Elcano's only reward for this is being given a coat of arms with spices on it, a cinnamon stick, cloves, and nutmegs. So, you know, it's not great. But what follows on from this is a major diplomatic row between Spain and Portugal about the Tordesillas line, because this is the original line across the Atlantic. It then is said to stretch around the world. So where would it be on the other side of the world? Well, Spain claims that it's there, and the Moluccas would then be in their area. Portugal claims that it's there, in which case the Moluccas are in the in the Portuguese area. Of course, this is all imperial nonsense, you could say, of European powers coming in to interfere with the lives of other people. The Tordesillas line is actually undefinable. What then follows is a major contest for the Moluccas between Spain and Portugal. For 20 years, between about 1525 and 1546, Spain and Portugal are fighting a micro war in the Moluccas for control of the spice trade. There are two leadings of clove-bearing islands. One's Ternate, which is Portuguese. The other is Tidore, which is Spanish. They're separated by about 500 meters. Each builds a fort on its island, drags in the local population on each side, and they blast each other to bits. There can only be one winner in this competition, and that's going to be Portugal, because Portugal can resupply itself from Malacca. The Spanish can't, because all their attempts to sail back across the Pacific fail. They send 4 expeditions to support their fight. They all get blown back to the Moluccas because they have not worked out a way to sail back across the Pacific Ocean. The Portuguese in the Moluccas dealt with the local people in a very brutal way. There's only one good man in this. Every 4 years, they send out a governor, and the best of these governors was a man called Antonio Galvão, who was actually horrified by what the Portuguese were doing to the local people. He regarded cloves as a source of evil. These islands are a warren of all evil and have no good but the clove. Insofar as it is the material cause of our people going there, it is an apple of all discord, and one could curse it more than gold itself. So it is effectively, you know, an example of European plundering. The Portuguese, having got to the Moluccas, their next step is to try and expand their network and reach and go to China. In 1517, with the aid of Chinese pilots, they make their way to Canton up the Pearl River. This is a Portuguese map of getting to the Pearl River, not very accurate. And they completely misunderstand the way that Chinese protocol works. They thought that they would be able to talk man to man with the Chinese emperor. It doesn't work like that. And they make themselves very unpopular. They try to build a fort at the mouth of the Pearl River. This is completely unacceptable within Chinese protocol. Many of the Portuguese are killed. They are banned from trading on the coast of China at all. And so the whole of the southern coast of China is really locked down to the Portuguese and other similar people. However, the economy of southern China does depend upon buying and selling, and spices are very valuable. So what we then get is a kind of smuggling operation on the islands off the coast of South China. Spices are actually in great demand at the imperial court. The problem for the Chinese is how to accommodate a valuable trade with foreigners without compromising Chinese territorial or imperial integrity. In the midst of all this, so we have these Portuguese smuggling expeditions, and there are all sorts of consequences of this, some of which are very extraordinary, because one ship, which is sailing off the coast of southern China, gets blown off course and lands on the Japanese island of Tanegashima. The Portuguese step ashore. In their hands, they have matchlock rifles. The shogun of the island is very interested in these, and he buys one and copies it. And what we then see develop out of this is what is called the Tanegashima era in Japan. Japan is a whole country or islands of warring shogunates. The accidental technology transfer leads to the development of firearms in in Japan. And this one single shot fired by a Portuguese man on the coast of Japan in 1543 changes Japanese history, because by the end of the 17th century, Japan is producing more firearms than the whole of Europe. One shogunate will get control of the whole of Japan with the use of firearms. And so this accidental offshoot, if you like, of the spice trade changes Japanese history. The Tokugawa shogunate becomes the leading force in Japan. Extraordinary little side consequence, if you like, of spice trading. The need for the south coast of China to be able to import spices and various other things remains. And in 1557, when Portuguese fleet is on its way to Japan, it stops at Macau. And here, the Portuguese commander of this fleet manages to come to an agreement, unofficial agreement, with the local dignitaries to allow goods to pass to and fro without any concession on Chinese dignity or territorial integrity. And the result is this foothold in China and Macau in 1557, sealed off by a gate. This is a 19th century version of the same thing. And this is to the benefit of both sides. So that the Portuguese can set up on Macau. They're entirely dependent for food on the Chinese. The Emperor of China has no knowledge of this operation, but it's an incredibly important step in the development of global trade. It's an informal arrangement between merchants. During this period, the Spanish are totally locked out of the Spice Islands because of the problem that they cannot sail back across the Pacific. They've had 4 expeditions, some launched around the Straits of Magellan, some from Mexico, and they've all been blown back. The issue for Spain is that it would like to crack the code of the Pacific winds so that they could sail to the Philippines or the Spice Islands and sail back again. In 1564, the King, Philip II of Spain, says, we're going to have another go at this. And he calls on this one man here. This is not an authentic picture of him. We don't know what he looked like. His name is Andres de Urdaneta. He, at this time, was a monk in a monastery in Mexico. But as a young man, he spent 11 years in the Moluccas, engaged in guerrilla war against the Portuguese. Very bright guy, and he had studied the meteorology in a great deal of detail. The king writes to Andres de Urdaneta in his monastery and says, please, will you lead an expedition to find a way back across the Atlantic, across the Pacific? So they set off 2 ships. The aim is not commercial, not to buy spices. It's just an expedition to discover how to sail back across the Pacific Ocean. Urdaneta is effectively in charge of this. He chooses the right time of year. He knows that you need to catch a wind up to Japan, and then you can catch another wind, which will take you back to Mexico. And he manages to do it, back to Acapulco. This is an incredibly important moment in world history because it means it's the final link in the chain of oceans and the ability for joining together continents and hemispheres. In 1571, based upon the fact that the Spanish can now sail between Mexico and the Philippines, the Spanish capture Manila. Manila is a major trade hub in an extensive and very old trading network linking the peoples and trades of Asia. It connects trading routes of Japan and China, Brunei, Java, Sumatra, and Malacca. This gives the Spanish a key foothold in the trade of the Far East. So you can see all these nodal points now joined together. The Spice Islands, Manila, Macau, Nagasaki, Malacca, Goa, and then round to Europe. And this is an incredible axis of trade that has been created. This is the last link, you might say, in the global chain of connectivity. The Spanish can now sail from Seville to La Habana and Veracruz on the Mexico. They can have goods carried across or across rivers to Acapulco. The goods can then be sailed across the Pacific Ocean to Manila. They can then trade with Macau and Japan and all the other places, and they can sail back again. And they can link in with South America. This has enormous consequences for global trade. And out of this, we see every year from Manila that a galleon route across the Pacific from Manila back to Mexico with the goods of the Far East takes place. These are the container ships of the age. They twice a year, when the wind is favorable, they make a long but indeed very arduous journey across the Pacific Ocean to Acapulco with all the goods of the Orient, effectively, in now an ever enlarging trading system, including spices, of course. These ships dock at Acapulco. This is the terminus of the Manila galleon route. There's a huge trade fair there. Goods are then carried or transported on rivers to Mexico City. Mexico City becomes a global city. It's the major link in a train of trade between Europe and the Far East. The most famous city, center of perfection, hinge of the world, said a visitor in the 16th century. What is happening at the same time is that we see the development of a global economy. I think about 1570, China changes its tax system. Whereas I think before taxes were paid either in crops or in labor, around this time, they moved to that all taxes shall be paid for in silver. And this, all the links of trade, which have been launched by the spice trade, now come into play. The difference in terms of European trade with the Far East is the vast quantities of silver that are discovered in the Andes in 1545. This is Spain's lucky day. In 1545, a prospector in the Bolivian Andes discovers a mountain rich in silver ore. It's called Potosi. The Spanish called it Cerro Rico, the rich hill. This is the site of the largest mining boom in world history. By the 17th century, it has a population of 160,000 people. It is as large as London or Paris. It is bigger than the mother city, Madrid. And the mining of this hill, of this mountain, is going to provide a huge flow of silver into the world system. The work is actually going to be undertaken by the unfortunate local people called the Quechua, who will toil up and down inside this mountain with candles strapped to their thumb, bringing down the ore to be smelted. Potosi is still there and still being mined in a small way. So this flood of silver into the system is the means by which Europeans can now trade, particularly with China. Silver is a global currency. The first book in English, it's the first book in Portuguese, I should say, it's translated into English, since Marco Polo, was a monk called Gaspar de Cruz, who came to China in 1569 and wrote a very detailed and amazed account of of Chinese life, its technology, its customs. And the thing he notices is every man has a pair of scales and weights in his house, because the common that goeth instead of money is silver by weight. No coins, just weighed silver. And we're going to see the role of silver around the world. This is a very famous painting by the Dutch artist Vermeer in 1664. It's a painting of a woman in Delft. What is this woman doing? She is weighing silver. So silver becomes the engine, if you like, of global trade from this. And out of this comes what you might call the situation in which we're in today. China produces, Europe consumes. A huge flow of silver into China in return to the most desirable manufactured products of the Chinese system. The most one that really captured the European imagination is Ming porcelain. No European pottery can replicate the secret of Ming pottery. And this becomes enormously popular in Europe. In vast quantities of Ming porcelain are bought along with other manufactured goods from China, silk goods and brocades and so on, but particularly Ming pottery. The Portuguese import between 40 and 60,000 pieces of Ming pottery a year. And the Chinese are very good at producing to the market. This is a plate for the Portuguese. On it, it has the Portuguese coat of arms at the bottom. It has this device here, which is the symbol of Portuguese exploration. Here it has the Latin initials for Jesus Christ the Savior. So if you're a rich man in Lisbon, you could order from China by about 1600 a dinner set with your own coat of arms on it. And you can find fragments of Ming pottery almost anywhere in the world, in the Andes, on the coasts of Kenya. The Ottomans bought vast quantities of Ming porcelain. If you've ever been to the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, they have a fantastic collection of Ming pottery. If you wanted to have a still life painted, the go-to thing was you needed to have Ming pottery in your picture. There are other consequences of this global chain now. One which is going to be very beneficial for China, as I understand it, because of the connectivity now, long-range connectivity between Europe and the Far East, across the Atlantic and the Pacific. We have what is now called the Magellan Exchange of species and crops. From Europe, we'll go back again. New staple crops are being introduced into the Far East. Sweet potatoes, maize and peanuts, cocoa, papaya, tomatoes, and tobacco. Sweet potatoes, maize, and peanuts particularly are going to improve the diet of the Chinese people. They can fill in between intervals in the rice harvest. There are dramatic improvements in China's nutrition. Faster maturing rice crops are introduced, which allow more crops a year. Somewhere between, in the 18th century, as a result of this Magellan exchange of crops, I think in China, the population doubles in the 18th century from 150 million to 300 million. One of the things that always puzzle me about this is that from Acapulco to Manila, which is a voyage of about 2 to 3 months, the Spanish managed to import horses and cattle into the Far East. Don't ask me how they did it, I don't know. So we've now got a completely connected world, if you like, in terms of trading routes, trading opportunities. I think of, as I said, I think I might have said at the beginning, I see the 16th century of the age of acceleration. Everything speeds up, of which the spice trade really was the initiator of exploration and its secondary consequences which rippled across the world. One of the effects in Europe is an information explosion in the 16th century, the knowledge that is coming in from the Far East in terms of cartography, map making, and printing. Having seen that the world, understood the world as a globe, we see the making of globes. People can understand the world, they can understand the planet as one thing. We start to see a great deal of printed atlases in Europe. This is the first pocket atlas in 1548. You could hold the world in your hand in this atlas. We see in 1570 the first modern European atlas of the world. It's a bit shaky in many of its details. South America's not looking too good. So people are becoming increasingly aware of the planet on which they live. We see Jesuits produce the first European-style world map in Chinese and introduce the concept of spherical Earth to China. This is Matteo Ricci, a Jesuit in China. It combines European knowledge of the world along with Chinese information. So people can understand more and more about the world in which they live. We also see in Europe the world being projected in print. This book in the middle by Gaspar de Cruz is the first printed book on China, the first real account of China since Marco Polo. Various other writers in Italian and in English are producing huge volumes of information about the world beyond. Critical to the development of the spice trade from that is a book published in Dutch at the end of the 16th century, the Itinerario of Jan Huygen van Linschoten. This is Linschoten was a secretary to the Portuguese Bishop of Goa, and he steals a great deal of commercial information about the spice routes to the east. He writes a book about it, he produces maps, and this provides a handbook for other merchants to journey to the Far East and enter the spice trade. And in the long run, the Dutch will get complete control of the spice trade. So we end up at the end of the century of a world that has exploded enormously out of this desire for the spice trade. My last word on this are just some words from Shakespeare, written at the very end of the century. Why then the world's mine oyster, which I with sword will open it. What he's saying is that for Europeans, the world is now discoverable and can be aggressively conquered. And indeed, we're going to see in the centuries that follow, for about 200 or 300 years, European imperialism. That is all that I've got to say, and that's quite enough to take in that time. Thank you very much for listening, and now maybe people can ask me some questions that I will not be able to answer, but thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. And you'll see there the book again from Yale University Press. So thank you as well to Yale University Press for publishing this book and for also helping organize this. Thank you so much, Roger, for joining us and for a fascinating talk. And thank you everybody for joining us. And feel
Thank
free
you very
to
much.
unmute
Thank you,
yourselves
Devin.
and thank our
Thank you for
speakers.
inviting me, and thank you for listening. Thanks a lot. Okay, bye.
Thank you.